It's podcast day. It's podcast day. Hello friends, Mars here. Thanks for joining me on another episode of the heyBrownBerry Knitting Podcast. I am sitting down at one of my sewing tables, and when I say one of my sewing tables, I don't mean to sound posh. It just means that there are different flat surfaces in the house where I like to spread out when I'm sewing. You are welcome here, and I'll tell you a little bit about what's going on in my hands here in a moment. But I want to say hello to all of you, and thank you so much for coming back or for checking me out. You can find me on Instagram and Ravelry and on Etsy as heyBrownBerry, which should be on the screen here. I am working right now on a small sewing project, and it's from a pattern by Allison of Daisy Lane Design. It's a bag pattern, and I must admit that recently I am bag obsessed. I've talked before about being the pouch queen. I love a good pouch. And sewing is not the craft with which I'm the most comfortable. I'm actually much more comfortable knitting and crocheting. But there are so many great designers out there who are producing sewing patterns that I've decided to challenge myself and dive in. So this bag pattern is the Beachcomber Bag, and Allison has done an excellent job of putting together a beginner-friendly format. I'll insert a picture of the finished bag here. A sweet little pouch with a circular bottom, available in 3 sizes. You can make one with a smaller 6-inch bottom, a larger 7-inch bottom, and she even gives you instructions on how to make one with a mesh bottom. So it's called the Beachcomber Bag in case you want to take a bag like this to the beach for things like shell collecting, rock collecting. Even I think about when I'm looking for natural dye materials and I'm out foraging for things like lichen and acorns and so on. There's always little bits attached to natural dye materials. So it's great for collecting that if you have a mesh bottom that debris can fall through. It's a really versatile pattern. From what I can tell so far, there's lots of little options, and I love that. Similarly to a knitting or a crochet pattern, aside from just options and sizes, sometimes designers will provide just smaller modifications or recommendations that make your first or second or fifth version of the pattern unique. So I'm right now working on pinning together the bottom of a smaller version of the bag. I'm using a lot of pins because this circular shape, as Allison points out in the pattern, is one that does require a bit of fiddling to align the right pieces. I'm not ashamed of having to use a ton of pins. It makes me feel more confident when it comes time to put this into the sewing machine. Are any of you new or fairly new sewers? Allison has a Beachcomber Bag make-along going on right now. I'll make sure to link her Instagram and Etsy shop information in the description box for this episode. So there are some of us who are trying out this bag, and I think learning a lot from it, quite honestly. Just 5 or so steps in, I'm already trying things I haven't tried before. I've done some other sewing recently, again, using a pattern from a maker friend. And it's helping me to learn certain things about myself as a maker, so I figured I'd share that with you. As always, if anything I'm saying resonates with you, or even if you have a different opinion, I'd like to hear about it. One of the things I've figured out since sewing in the last couple of weeks is I make a lot fewer mistakes if I separate out the major steps in a project. For example, in a recent bag I was making, I felt much more inspired when I did the cutting of the fabric pieces on one day and then the stitching together of those pieces the following day. When I tried it, doing everything at once, by the time it came to the step for me to sew the pieces together, I think my energy was just so much lower. I tend to get a bit anxious about the cutting part because I'm so conscious of waste that I do a lot of extra checking and double checking and triple checking before I cut. And I tend to beat myself up when I make a mistake in cutting. I'm sure I'll get over that in time, but because of that, by the time I finish cutting out the pieces and everything's done properly, I'm pretty wiped out. I don't always use a flat surface for each step, so quite often I'm on the floor, bent over my fabric. I like to use a rotary cutter for most steps, and so it's some physical labor involved in there. And I found that on the days when I would cut on day one and then sew on day two, whenever that would happen to be, I had a lot more energy for the sewing and I was much more precise and I was more careful with my stitching. Another thing I've learned about making in general, which came to me because I've recently been doing some natural dyeing, some sewing, and some knitting, all of which have been on a somewhat larger scale. So more than one skein of dye, a large sweater project, multiple sewn bags. What I've learned about myself in doing those things is I like a multi-step project. So for example, with natural dyeing, quite often you get your best results if you can be patient enough to either let the dye material soak or to let it heat for a significant amount of time, or even to let the dyed yarn or fabric sit in the dye stock for hours, days, even weeks. And I'm not patient by nature with many things, especially with things that I'm doing myself. But recently, I've found a real joy in each of those steps, and I think I finally figured out why. Things that I haven't done a lot or that I might find intimidating are so much easier or more enjoyable, I should say, when I break them down into small success steps. So if I am dyeing something and I find that going through the first step of soaking the dye material and being patient enough to wait a few days brings out a beautiful color, well, that step and that wait time has value, and so it feels good. It feels like I've checked a box. I got great color and I'm just a little bit further along the process. With sewing, if I take my time and I cut on one day and I stitch on another day, or I really take my time at the machine, my stitching looks better, I'm happier with the outcome, and each time I do a step of a cut or a pinning or sewing, I've checked off another box. So I guess I'm a fan of the multi-step process because they're like tiny little wins along the way. So another thing that I'm trying, this is for the first time today, is I read over the pattern so that I could understand all of the instructions and I could understand all of the pieces I needed to cut. And then last night when I was cutting, I decided to cut out enough material for 2 bags. And that really has a couple of advantages. For one, going through a sewing pattern multiple times gives me greater comfort. The first time I'm just completely relying on the instructions as I see them, and I'm following them step by step, and I'm not necessarily putting together in my mind what's happening. Usually by the second or even third time through, I understand the shapes better. I understand how one step in the process affects the outcome in the end. So having cut out 2 pieces or 2 sets for 2 bags, I get the benefit of going through the process a couple times in rapid succession. The second advantage is if something goes wrong with item A, I can fix it with item B. So it's a backup plan. I'm giving you a sneak peek here of the fabrics I've chosen for this bag. There are 3 different types of fabric that I'm going to use for these 2. One is this solid burgundy. The other is this checked blue and gray. And the other is a solid gray. So between those 3 fabrics, I have my outer bag, my inner bag lining, and the bag bottom. What I've done so far is pinned the circular bottom to the tube, which will ultimately be the bag. And as you saw in the picture, this is going to be a drawstring bag, so I'm going to learn how to make a drawstring channel for the first time. So now I'm going to get back to pinning the next bag bottom onto the body. I'm going to show you a little bit of the work that I'm doing on this sweater. It's a pattern that's coming out from the fiber company later this year, but I wanted to just show a specific element that I'm working on, which is attaching the sleeve to the body using the Kitchener stitch. This is a decent sized sweater. It's a pullover, and I had heard a couple of my knitting friends talk about knitting the sleeves first and then attaching them to the body using grafting or Kitchener stitch. I love this technique. I will have talked in the podcast about why I chose to do this, and I thought I'd just show you a little bit of how I'm progressing on doing the actual attachment. So you can see that I have one sleeve here that's still separate. It's on some waste yarn, which just happens to be the same color as the yarn in the sleeve. And then I have the other sleeve mid-graft, so the grafting is in progress. You can see here that I knit the body top down. I separated for the body and sleeves. And then I am grafting this sleeve onto the body using Kitchener stitch. And even though this has not been blocked yet, you can see that the Kitchener works really well for a pretty seamless graft. Essentially how this works is you have 2 openings, the opening of the sleeve that's part of the sweater body, and then the opening of the sleeve, the lower portion, which I've knit separately. Each of them was held on waste yarn, and now I'm bringing them together with Kitchener stitch. I put the stitches onto individual small circular needles. I just did that by removing the waste yarn and one stitch at a time, transferred those stitches onto each of these circular needles. That allows me to bring 2 needle ends together from each portion of the sweater. And then I threaded about 4 times the circumference of the sleeve in a yarn length that is now put on this darning needle. And if you're familiar with Kitchener stitch, you'll know that this is a very typical setup. You've got the 2 sets of stitches that you want to graft on either 2 ends of the same needle, or in my case, 2 separate sets of needles, since I'm bringing together 2 separate parts of the sweater. So I'm just going to show you how I do my Kitchener graft. There are loads of great tutorials out there on how to do the Kitchener stitch. And I go through a little mantra that helps me remember the direction that I need to use to thread this yarn through. The thing to remember is what you're really doing is just creating another row of knit stitches in between the 2 different portions. And the idea is that it should be seamless. There shouldn't be much puckering or much of a difference at that join point. Again, since this is unblocked, you can kind of tell where I've done my previous Kitchener stitches. So I'm going to go through the grafting motion first, and then I'll talk you through it. The Kitchener is essentially a 4-step process, and in the mantra that I use, I make reference to knit and purl, and that speaks to the direction essentially that I am inserting the darning needle into the stitches on the needles. I refer to these as my front needle and back needle relative to where they are to my body. So this one is closer to my body in the front, this one is away from my body in the back. The mantra goes like this: knit off, purl on. Purl off, knit on. So if I just talk you through each of those, when I say knit off, I mean that on the front needle, this first stitch, I enter it knitwise from left to right, and I take it off the end of the needle. And I don't have to pull my yarn through, but I'm going to here. So that was knit off. Purl on means I enter this stitch purlwise, right to left, and I leave it on the needle and pull my yarn through. Got to be careful where your yarn tails end up so you don't have a lot of tangling or yarn ending up in the wrong place. On the back needle, I do a purl off by entering that first stitch purlwise and taking it off the needle. And then I do knit on. I enter that second stitch knitwise and leave it on the needle. So the mantra is knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on. Now at the beginning of any Kitchener stitch, you're going to have quite a bit of yarn because you've used a really long length to make sure you have enough yarn for the grafting. But if you take your time, you can pull the threads through without too much of a hassle. I've gotten myself a little bundle here that I just need to slowly undo. Again, with each of those 4 steps, you're creating a row of knit stitches in between the 2 parts of the garment or the sock toe or whatever it is that you're grafting together. And you can look as you go to make sure that you're snugging up the stitches, not too tight. If you do them too tight like I did back here, you'll notice a bit of puckering. It's good to try to keep sort of a moderate tension, and then some of this will block out in the end. So that's how I will Kitchener this sleeve to the sweater body. Yay! Another sewing project complete. Love it. It's done. Drawstring pouch using the pattern by Leigh of the Louleigh podcast. I added some details that I'm really enjoying. This little leather tab is just from some pieces of leather that I bought on a trip to North Carolina. And there's a little chain on there in case I want to attach anything. This little button detail is from Katrinkles. I am a fan of that shop. Super cute notions and functional tools too. So I did this with a heavier fabric bottom and a lighter quilting cotton top. Had some rope in my stash for the drawstring and some more quilting cotton for the inside. I really like this combination of prints and colors. So it stands up well. It's very narrow, so I think it'll be great for a spindle. So just like with knitting projects, I tend to think about what I will be sewing next while I'm still sewing the current project. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I like to think about what I'm going to do with leftovers. So if I have leftover fabric, I like to make a plan for it if I can, especially if it's enough to make something else on its own. A couple of the projects I'm planning on are more project bags. I am the pouch princess after all. I do love a good tote pouch project bag. And I'm thinking that these combinations will work really well. This is some knit fabric with the Dunkelgrun logo on it. Anna of Dunkelgrun is an excellent friend and podcaster who hand drew her logo and had it created as fabric on Spoonflower. You might know the website spoonflower.com, where you can get very artistic, really lovely fabrics of all different materials, usually with hand-drawn or independently designed prints. And I thought that this would look really nice with a lining of some naturally dyed fabric. This was fabric that I dyed. It's a cotton fleece kind of material, and I dyed it with red onion skin. With yellow onion skins quite some time ago. Yellow onion skin tends to yield a really nice bright yellow or orangey yellow color. So what I did is that I had some strips of that fabric, and I decided to patchwork that together as well. So I seamed up a bunch of pieces to try to get as large a piece of material as I could, and then ultimately I'm hoping to make a small bag with this as the lining and Anna's fabric as the outer bit. Since it's knit fabric, it'll probably be a drawstring bag, or I might add some interfacing to stiffen it up a bit. These prints are from some fat quarters that I got from a local quilt shop called Stitchcraft. My friend Carrie Lynn is a big part of my love of sewing because she taught me a couple of years ago how to make a zipper project bag. And I've gone to the shop where she worked for a while and gotten some great fabrics from there. So the combination of these two fat quarters really caught my eye. And I'm thinking I'll make a zipper tote out of this as well. I've already started a bit of work on this. I've learned that as a sewer, I like to do the sewing steps in parts. I don't do as well when I do all of the steps for a project in one day. So I like to do things like this, where I decide the pieces I want to use, I cut them out, put them together if that's appropriate. I even ironed on some interfacing for this one. And what I'm planning is a bag that has this dark brown bit as the bottom and these printed pieces on the top. So if I put them together, you can kind of see the idea. So the bottom of the bag will be dark brown and the tops will have this beautiful print. Most likely I'm going to insert a zipper. So I just have to choose a lining for that one. I do like lined bags. Sometimes I make my decisions based on materials that I find in my stash. I found this blue suede cording. I'll give you a closer look at that. And I think the color is gorgeous. And it would make a great drawstring or just a little tab on the side of a bag. Who knows? Maybe some sort of decorative element. So I don't know exactly where that'll end up, but I put it in sight so that it can inspire me. There's some pieces here that are really small, and they may not be able to make anything on their own, but there's fun prints in here. And that gives me ideas of things I can combine. I would actually like to work on a bag that uses these remnants. And I'm new to working with directional fabric, which means fabrics that have a distinct position. So the cute little creatures on this one, you know, you'd want them all to be facing up when you use this. And in order to make the kind of bag I have in mind, I have to consider how I put these together so that they stay in the same direction. So it's just small things like that that help me towards my improvement in my sewing projects. So I pin those together, making little tabs out of extra fabric pieces and keeping them with my sewing scraps. It does make it easier when I get ready to do a project to have some of these things already cut or put together. Keeping combinations that I like. This is one of my favorites. It just inspires me when it comes time to sew if I've already got some things laid out. Well, friends, that's it for this episode. I do have some more things to share with you, some more sewing and some natural dyeing. And I think I'll save that for another episode. I'm so glad you were here. I'll see you next time. Bye.